6 games. 0 games. That's not a rough set. That's not a bad afternoon. That's a bagel handed to the third best tennis player alive in a championship final on a Monday afternoon in the capital of the United States. 20 hours earlier, the woman who did that was losing. Stay with me, because the answer to how this happened isn't on a scoreboard. A hotel room, somewhere close to midnight, the night before the biggest match of her life. A phone screen lighting up a face that hasn't slept properly in 6 days. Not highlight reels. Not a coach's notes on the first set she just lost, 6-4. Messages from her parents. From friends 12 time zones away who stayed up in the middle of the night just to watch her go down a break to the best mover on the entire tour. She'll say later that she read them and felt something very specific. Not pressure. Not fear. She'll call it love. Just that word. Standing in the middle of all of it, at her first real shot at a title. She decided something before she ever walked back onto that court. Whatever happened next, this exact moment was already a win. Nobody filmed that room. There's no clip of it anywhere. But that is where this story actually turns. Rewind 20 hours. Sunday afternoon, Washington. The final is scheduled for noon. It doesn't start at noon. 1:30 comes and goes. Then they push it to 2:45. Lightning is close enough to the grounds that officials are clearing the site entirely. Warm up, cool down, wait, warm up again. By the time they finally walk out, it's almost 3 o'clock. And 3 hours of holding yourself at competitive readiness has broken better players than this before a single ball is struck. Jessica Pegula, world number 3, 11 career titles, does exactly what a player with 11 career titles does under pressure. She breaks serve. She holds to love. 6-4, first set gone. Then, at 2-1 in the second, the sky opens again. The tarps come across the court, and this time they don't come off. Play is suspended. Rescheduled to 6. Rescheduled again to 9. By 9 that night, the tournament gives up entirely and pushes the whole match to Monday noon. Watch the stands in that moment, because this is the image worth sitting with. Philippine flags soaked through, being folded up by people walking toward the exits. Fans who flew across an ocean for this exact week, who are never going to see how it ends tonight, because the ending isn't coming tonight at all. By the time the last of them file out, the seats behind the baseline are just rows of empty plastic catching rain under the stadium lights, and somewhere inside the building, a 21-year-old has to find a way to sleep on a lost set. She walks off that court a set down, 20 hours and 14 minutes from the biggest match of her career, carrying the exact same question that had been following her for more than a year. A question that had nothing to do with talent, nothing to do with how hard she hit a forehand or how fast she moved side to side. Something else entirely. Here is what the evidence actually said in that moment, if you were being honest about it. 1 whoop to final in her career, and 4 championship points lost inside it. No tour title anywhere, at any level that counted. A first set she had just lost to love. An opponent ranked 3 in the world she had never once beaten in her life. Every single piece of that pointed toward the same answer, and that answer was no. To understand why that question was heavy enough to follow her across an ocean and back, you have to go all the way back to a country that had never once had anyone to point to. Quezon City, May 2005. Her mother swam competitively, won a bronze medal at the SEA Games back in the 80s, so the idea of pointing your entire childhood at a sport wasn't strange in that house. Tennis was. The Philippines' 115 million people had produced exactly 0 WTA or ATP singles champions in the entire recorded history of the sport. Not one. Ever. So there was no blueprint to follow. No former champion who could sit her down and tell her which parts of this were survivable, because nobody had survived them yet. At 13 years old, she left. 11,000 kilometers, Quezon City to Mallorca, to train at the Rafa Nadal Academy in a language she didn't speak yet, in a country she would essentially live in from that point forward. That is the year the word first got attached to her name. Future, said like a compliment. Functioning like a sentence not yet. Not this year. Come back when it's real. For a while, it looked earned. 2022, she wins the US Open Junior title, and the label hardens into something bigger. The future of Philippine tennis, the future of Asian tennis, the future of the entire tour. One broadcaster would later put it bluntly, she'd stop being an athlete and become a spectacle, a name that filled arenas whether or not she was the one seeded to win them. Then March of 2025, Miami, a WTA 1000 event, one of the biggest tournaments on the calendar outside the four majors. She runs all the way to the semifinals with an entire country awake at 3 in the morning to watch, and loses in 3 tight sets. Remember the name of the woman standing on the other side of that net. Pegula. Everyone calls Miami a breakthrough. Nobody calls it a title. Great week, kid. Come back next year. If you've ever done something genuinely good and watched it get filed under potential instead of achievement, you already know exactly what that feels like. It's not failure. It's almost worse than failure, because failure at least ends the conversation. 11 weeks later, she gets her chance to end that sentence for good. Eastbourne, England, a grass court final, her first ever WTA final. And she has it in her hands. 4 separate championship points. 4 separate times, 1 single point away from doing something no Filipino athlete had ever done in the history of the sport. 4 separate times, it moves. She loses all 4. Then, she loses the match. There is no version of that afternoon that ends quietly. She has to walk to the net. She has to shake the hand of the woman who just took the thing she'd been building toward for 6 years. She has to sit through the trophy ceremony holding a runner-up plate in front of cameras, in front of a crowd that came expecting a coronation and watched a collapse instead. And then she has to fly to the next tournament. Because the tour doesn't wait for anyone to recover. A scoreline can't show you what that actually is. It isn't nerves failing for one unlucky afternoon. 4 championship points don't vanish because a forehand forgets its job on one particular point. What costs you 4 championship points in a row is the accumulated weight of every person back home who stayed up for it, stacked on top of a word she never asked anyone to give her. It is not the loss itself that stays with an athlete. The loss is one afternoon, over almost as soon as it happens. What stays is the question underneath it, the one that follows you into every locker room after. After Eastbourne, the question attached to her name stopped being, is she good enough? Everyone had already settled that one. It got smaller, and far crueler, does she know how to close? Here's the strange part. The next 12 months should have answered that question one way or the other. They didn't. They made it louder. She beats top 10 opponents 7 separate times across the season. She walks onto grass at Wimbledon against the defending champion of the tournament, on a court where the champion has lost almost nothing all year, and beats her in straight sets while a section of the crowd waves a flag that has no business being that far from home. Her ranking climbs to a career-high 29. She wins a Title I tier below the main tour, a real trophy, and everyone inside professional tennis knows it still isn't the same thing as a WTA title. Beat the best players in the world, on any surface, over and over, and still walk away from every single season with an empty spot on the shelf where the actual title belongs. So by the time Washington begins, the paradox is sitting right there in plain sight. A player who can beat almost anyone alive on a given day, who still doesn't have the one result that would make any of it official. Her level was never the problem. Her level, by any honest measure, was already finished. What was missing lived somewhere a coach and a ball machine can't reach. Which brings you back to that hotel room. Because here's the twist nobody wrote about afterward. The thing that finally answered the question wasn't a technical fix. It wasn't a coach's whiteboard or hours of film on a laptop at 3 in the morning. It was a 21-year-old, alone, choosing to put the weight down before she ever picked the racket back up. Monday, noon, half the food stands are still closed. Parking is limited. 10 minutes into the restart, you can see it before the scoreboard shows that she's standing closer to the baseline, taking the ball earlier, going for the lines instead of waiting for Pegula to make a mistake first. They trade holds all the way to 4 games apiece, the exact score where the first set had slipped through her hands the day before. This time it doesn't slip. She breaks. She serves it out. 1 set apiece, and a final that had been alive for 22 hours of real time starts over completely from zero. Then the third set happens, and it isn't close. 1 game, 2, 3, she breaks Pegula 3 separate times in a single set against the world number 3 in a final. 6 games to love. Across every single service game she plays in that set, she loses 8 points. Not 8 games, 8 points. Total, across the entire set. 84% of points won behind her first serve. 10 of the last 13 games of the match belonged to her, and the final wasn't even the most impressive thing she did that week. Round 1, no first round bye, straight into a match against an Olympic gold medalist down a set, comes back to win in 3. Round 2, down 5 games to 1 against the tournament's defending champion, comes back and wins that too. The quarterfinal, the second seed, beaten 6-3, 6-4, the exact scoreline she'd beaten her by 6 weeks earlier, on a completely different surface, against a coaching staff that had every piece of video and still couldn't move the result by a single game. The semifinal, a 4-time Grand Slam champion, gone in straight sets in under 80 minutes. She didn't win Washington by playing beautifully from the first point to the last. She won it by winning, over and over, the matches she was already losing. By the time the trophy ceremony ends and the crowd noise finally settles, this had already stopped being a tennis story. Rafael Nadal, the man whose academy took in a homesick 13-year-old more than a decade ago, posted about the win himself, calling it well-earned for all the work behind it. Manny Pacquiao, the most famous athlete his country has ever produced, called her heart Filipino and called her something nobody had ever called her before. Not future champion. Champion, present tense, because this is the part that travels past the scoreboard, past tennis entirely. Somewhere out there right now, somebody is carrying a word exactly like hers, maybe not future, but some cousin of it. Not yet. Almost so close. Overlooked by name again and again, while everyone insists it's a compliment. Filipino fans didn't just fill a stadium in Washington that week, they were loud enough that Pegula, playing on what was technically her home soil, said afterward she could hear that same noise from inside her hotel room days earlier in Dubai. A woman who's already reached the top of the sport, being outnumbered on her own turf by a nation that had never had anyone to cheer for before. Think about what that actually requires. 115 million people, a sport that historically belonged to whichever country, could afford tens of millions of dollars a year in youth development, and none of that infrastructure back home to speak of. Courts painted onto old basketball squares. No factory pipeline of talent, no decades of institutional knowledge to lean on. Just one family that decided to send a 13-year-old across an ocean on a scholarship and see what came back. That isn't really a tennis story either. It's the specific weight of being underestimated for years by people who were never going to apologize for it, and the strange, quiet relief of finally not needing them to. And she is nowhere near finished. Toronto is next. A tournament most players treat as a routine tune-up, except this time she walks in seated, for the first time in her career, a target instead of a surprise. Then New York, the US Open, starting the 30th of August, where every player left in that draw has now watched the tape and knows exactly what happens if they let this match reach a third set. A career high ranking inside the world's top 20. The first player from her country to ever get there. Back home, tennis courts that used to sit empty are now fully booked out weeks in advance, and a nation that has spent generations measuring its sporting pride almost entirely in boxing gloves and basketball sneakers just found a second sport to measure it in. A president hosted a reception for her. Local clubs are scrambling to upgrade courts nobody had bothered maintaining a year ago. None of that happens for someone who's still just a promise. That happens for someone people have started planning around. For the first time in her career, the pressure in the next room isn't a country hoping. It's a country expecting. And that is a completely different kind of weight to carry onto a court. So go back to the word this whole story started with. Future, it doesn't fit anymore, and if you're honest, it never quite fit to begin with. It was just the safest thing to call someone before anybody was sure. She is not arriving. She already arrived, 20 hours after everyone thought the story was over. Inside a hotel room nobody filmed, where she decided the ending before she ever knew it herself. 6 games. 0 games. That was never the moment she became great. That was just the moment the rest of the world finally noticed. Which player do you think actually costs herself more in the long run, the one who chokes under pressure when it matters most, or the one who's simply never been handed the trophy she already earned? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know who you were watching before this week. In a few years, when everyone knows this name, you'll want a record of when you knew first.